I'm delighted today to be speaking with Jay Medenwalt. Now, Jay is currently a PhD candidate at Baylor University in the area of social psychology. He also has an MDiv with a concentration in apologetics and ethics and another concentration in biblical studies from Denver Seminary. He also has an MA in the psychological sciences, and previously he worked for 9 years as a behavioral scientist in the Air Force, which sounds very cool. And we're having Jay on today to talk first a little bit about the interface between apologetics and psychology. There's not a lot of people, to my mind, that I can think of who have a background in psychology and are doing significant work in apologetics. So I want to hear what difference that makes. But our main topic in a moment is going to be talking about the Enneagram, which you may have heard about. It's become very popular in the last several years in many Christian circles. And there's also controversy about it and questioning about it. So we're going to kind of dive into that today. Jay knows a lot about that. But first of all, Jay, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit. You're at Baylor, right? And you're doing doctoral work there. And you've got a background in psychology. What is the relationship between psychology and apologetics? People tend to think about philosophy, maybe biblical studies, logic when it comes to apologetics. What role does psychology play in apologetics?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot because for some people it's not really intuitive, and other people it really makes sense right away. So I think there's a few avenues where psychology and apologetics kind of touch each other in unique ways that are different than you get with other fields. So one, I say probably most obvious, I think what may be most important for getting more psychologists into apologetics is the way that apologetics is done. There are some books and resources out there for how to do apologetics and how to have a method that is more effective in reaching people, but there's not really much out there or really anything that's really grounded in good psychological science on the science of persuasion and relationship building and counseling and those types of methods, and how we can use those for doing apologetics, and not just for the sense of converting people, but just for discipleship and conversations and keeping that kind of door open for kind of evangelistic efforts. So that's one area that I think is really important. Another is some of the arguments, traditional arguments you get with apologetics, such as trying to defend the empty tomb or the resurrection accounts and the memory. So psychologists study memory, learning and memory. So how can we know that's reliable? How can we know it wasn't just faulty memory? Or how do we know it wasn't, say, schizophrenia or some sort of mass hysteria? So psychology can add to the arguments some depth in some ways like that, but also maybe for some other arguments, maybe add show that maybe some of the arguments out there maybe aren't as good as people previously thought. And not to get into details because that can be very controversial sometimes, but psychologists study the way that we think. And so we can see and measure certain biases that are present in the way people think and reason. And so one, we can help overcome them, but we can show that, like, well, this is maybe good reason to think that there might be bias on one side or the other going on. And then the last would be just to talk more and have more resources in apologetics from a perspective of kind of the goodness and beauty that we see in the world, and how that kind of relates to human kind of will and desire. And so Rebecca McLaughlin's book, Confronting Christianity, was actually a good example from that. And there's a psychologist, Lucian Conway, he actually goes by Luke, but he wrote a apologetics book that didn't really get a lot of press, unfortunately, but it's called Complex Simplicity, and he goes into a lot of how Christianity kind of answers our human needs and emotions, and does that from a psychological perspective.
Okay, so I hear you. You said three things there, and this is my take on them. So the first one, psychology can help us in terms of method. So we can, for example, in persuasion, we can communicate more effectively and winsomely to others. Second, psychology gives us resources to deal with specific apologetic issues, such as you said, the role of memory and understanding memory. And then it can also just give us a more fulsome apologetic in terms of presenting the richness of the Christian worldview to others. Can I just come back to the first one for a moment? I think a lot of people have concerns the minute we talk about persuasion they're thinking manipulation. It's sort of that, well, apologetics, you should just lay out logical, rational arguments. The minute you get into persuasion, you're manipulating people, and there's something wrong with that. Can you just kind of give a response to that?
Yeah, that's good. And that's so one of the presentations I'll give sometimes is actually on the science of persuasion for apologetics. And kind of the first thing I address is that very thing. And I go through and some of the main differences between persuasion and manipulation. And so when I say persuasion, what I see as a difference is when we are trying to persuade people in a loving Christian way, we are trying to encourage them to think better rather than think worse and make an emotional decision. We're also not going to put and use high pressure tactics and try and kind of force people to kind of feel like they have to make a decision in a way where they're not fully thinking and engaging their mind. Whereas you see that with more manipulation type tactics, they say with like a car salesman or something like that. So, and then the other one I would say is that which you can't always see, but when we're trying to persuade someone, we're not doing it for our own benefit. We're trying to help and promote the other person again in their thinking, in their reasoning, in their life. We're not trying to get another notch in the belt. Whereas with manipulation, we're just kind of doing it for ourselves to make ourselves look good or feel good, or to try and get something out of it.
Okay, that makes sense. Uh,
Yeah.
can I just suggest, could there be another role for psychology? And I'm just going to throw this out, get your feedback. I think of psychology classically and the social sciences more generally as as a whole, having been relatively hostile to or skeptical to organized religion and Christianity. And I think, for example, people like Sigmund Freud, right, and then some popularizing some deeply cynical views about the origin of belief in God and the value of religion and so on. Is there also then a role to think of the person who does apologetics from within the field of psychology as also doing apologetics for the community of psychologists who often are, as a group, generally skeptical of Christianity?
Yeah, I think there's probably a role for that to some extent. And um, certainly maybe to reach psychologists, but then coming down, people who are studying psychology or interested in it, or addressing some of the claims and criticisms from people with a psychology background. So Steven Pinker, a Harvard psychologist, does some stuff on atheism, and so he's a well-known voice out there. Sam Harris, so he's a neuroscientist, but a lot of what he does and talks about bleeds into psychology. Michael Shermer, another one. And actually, didn't you debate Michael Shermer? Am I confusing that
Uh,
with someone
no,
else?
I
I thought you
debated
did.
Dan
Okay.
Barker,
Okay.
but they look kind of similar.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I think they recall they have kind of similar stories, but both were very conservative Christians at one point. But Michael Shermer has a, I think, PhD in psychology or a related background. And so have some criticism even Daniel Dennett, and as a philosopher doing the philosophy of mind stuff that bleeds into psychology. So we get some of these criticisms from psychologists or people from the field. And there, as you mentioned, people always bring up Freud or Jung or things like that. And so there's certainly needs to be someone or people who can address their questions or issues, especially when you talk about sexuality and gender. And again, that's a topic that's not always handled in the most delicate way.
Right.
Um, so yeah, there's certainly that role as well.
Yeah, that's another whole can of worms. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that often those are issues that are complex, things like gender dysphoria that I think the Christian community sometimes lacks nuance in how they're taking on those issues. I don't want to get on a tangent here, but since you're here, I just want to throw out Paul Vitz. Does that name ring a bell for you?
Yep.
Um, so he kind of provocatively argued kind of a reverse a Freudian interpretation that atheism comes from similar psychological origins. Do you know anything about his views, and do you find any credibility to those views that
Yeah.
he
So
argued?
he's a legitimate psychologist. I can't remember if he's still alive actually. So he wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless. I've actually got it on my shelf. I haven't read it. I'm familiar with some of the research that he cites and he's relying on and do research in that area, but I don't know enough specifically about what his claims. But from my understanding of the little bit I have interacted with it, is he's essentially saying that he's responding to Freud's claim that people believe because they basically had a poor relationship with their father, and so they're looking for an eternal father figure, and God fills that role. And so he's looking at the research and saying it's actually the opposite. Are people who do not have a good relationship with their father or parents are the ones who are more likely to not believe. Again, this is something I want to read soon and go into more of his work, but from what I know of the research, separate from what Paul's done. So again, we're presumably or should be pulling from the same places. It's a little more complex than that. And again, maybe he goes through that and says that in the book. But essentially what you get with the research on attachment figures and belief in God is if a person has a good relationship with their parents, they are more likely to adopt their parents' belief system. So in a Christian country or a country that's mostly Christian, that means that if they have a good relationship with their parents, are likely to adopt Christian beliefs or similar theistic beliefs. And so it would be people who have a poor relationship or attachment with their parents who are likely to then change to a different religion or atheism in this case. But it would be the opposite then for atheists. So atheists who have children, their kids, if they have a good relationship with their kids, are likely to maintain their atheism. But if they don't, then they're likely to switch. So it's kind of like a goes both ways kind of deal. And that's one of the things I often point out when we talk about these things from psychology, when it's often used to say, well, people just believe because it's psychological bias or whatever. It's like, well, there's two sides to the coin and it kind of works both ways.
Yeah. All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, we're no more rabbit trails. We're now going to dive into talking about the Enneagram. Now, this has been, I mean, I know a lot of people around me use it. I hear about it all the time. I don't think I've done it myself. I've done a lot of these personality tests over the years. But let's just start off. What is it? Where did it come from? Let's start off there.
Yeah. So what is it is itself a kind of difficult question, at least for some people, because uh, my inclination and the way I describe it and the way the books will often describe it is essentially it's this personality type system. So it's a system that has 9 different personality types. So Ennea means 9 in Greek. So Enneagrams are 9 different personality types. But the problem is often when I describe it that way, and even though the books Richard Rohr and Rizzo and Hudson describe it and use the word personality type, people often get critical of that language because they say, well, it's more than that. And on the one hand, it kind of is more than that, but on the other, it's one of those things where it's kind of claimed to be more than that. But when we look at the personality literature and personality science, any claim from the Enneagram isn't any different than what we look at in personality science. So it's not really different, even though people will often claim that it is. So essentially, you've got these 9 different personality types that have specific ways in which they interact with each other. So if you're a 5, so for instance, I would say I'm most closely a 5, although I don't always consistently score as a 5, and that's, I think, one of the issues we'll talk about later. But as a 5, I can either have a 4 wing, which is kind of like a subtype, or a 5 or a 6 wing. Sorry, so either side as a kind of a subtype. So I can't have any other type as a wing. So there's these very specific and defined ways in which the types relate to each other. It's more complex than that. We can get into that if you want.
So when the advocates of it say it's more than a personality test, a classification system, what is the more that they are claiming it is?
Yeah, so there's a range of, so one would be like a spiritual tool for spiritual growth and development. So something that can help you get closer to God or relate to God better. Others will say it's more of like a growth tool, so that it's how you can grow and overcome your issues and know that your deepest needs and fears, and so that you can grow and motivate or grow beyond that, so that it's kind of giving you insight in that way. So in a way that's not necessarily personality, but again, it's what we look at in personality. And the other one I've heard is that it's a motivational system. So it's motivation, a system of motivational types is essentially is what I've heard people say, not know the words exactly, but that it all comes down to motivation. But again, motivation is something we study in personality psychology. So it's still the same thing there, but you often get just people want to try and give it more than just saying it's just personality.
Okay. Now, Where does that I mean, it seems to me that I hear a lot more about the Enneagram than other personality classification tests among Christians or within religious contexts. And I'm wondering if that's a
Mhm.
correct perception, and if so, why? Why is this the one that a lot of people say this not only gives you your personality, but something more in terms of your spiritual development? Where does that idea come from?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple reasons why that might be. I think you're probably right. At least right now, I think it's really popular among religious and spiritual people in general, not just Christians. But I think two reasons. One is because the way and the people who developed it and the way they did and who they kind of reached to and who brought it essentially to the U.S. It was brought by Bob Ox, who's or he was one of the people at least, was a Catholic of some order, I forget whatever, and he's the one who taught it to Richard Rohr, who then spread it very widely. And actually, Mitch Pakawa, I think is his name, was another person who learned it either at the same time or similar as Richard Rohr, another Catholic person. Actually wrote a book against it, one of the first books against it. But that use of it in Richard Rohr's book, The Enneagram from a Christian Perspective, played a role. And then so like Helen Palmer was another early adopter of the Enneagram back in '70s, I think. She was a former, maybe still is, I don't know, a psychic, and so is a kind of a spiritual kind of utility tool there. So I think that's part of it, is kind of how it came to, at least to the U.S. The other is that it's often talked about in terms of how it is a spiritual tool, and it can help you grow and develop spiritually, or grow closer to God, or have a kind of remove barriers in your relationship with God. So I think even one of the books it's called The Sacred Enneagram. I think that's the name of Chris Hertz's book on it. So it's got these uses that where it's being used to say, hey, this is a spiritual tool. It can be used for spiritual growth and development, and it can help you know God better and connect in that way with Him. So those two reasons, I think, is why.
Mm. Um, is there any link? Well, I've heard some people object to it, and they do so on religious grounds, that they believe there's some sort of link between the Enneagram and New Age, or I get some nebulous connections to some sort of Eastern religion or to the occult or something else. Is there anything to those concerns?
Uh, yes and no. So this is requires a little nuance here. So there's kind of two origin stories, or maybe three, I guess you could call it, with the Enneagram. One, I guess we'll just kind of make them two, but one is it's the kind of this ancient system that came from maybe several religions, and some will say it has these early usage within Christian communities back they go back to Evagrius in, I think, the 400s. So they were saying maybe used then, and then some of these, other Eastern religions, and it was this oral tradition that was passed on and eventually made its way, became popular among Sufis. And so that's the connection, where which is allegedly where this Russian mystic George Gurdjieff learned it, and he's the one that actually developed the actual symbol. So that was early 1900s, and so that's kind of one origin of how it developed. And if we continue that kind of on the same trajectory, Claudio Naranjo, he's a Chilean psychiatrist, and I can't believe I'm blanking on his name right now. This is kind of embarrassing. Do you know the other guy's name who developed the Enneagram?
Not me, no.
That's really funny. But I can't think of his name. Oscar Chazo, or Chazo. That's it. So
Okay.
Oscar Chazo, another South American, I don't think Chilean. I think he was kind of a philosopher, mystic. Oscar Chazo was. So he and Claudio Naranjo kind of developed it together. So Chazo had it first, and then he taught it to Naranjo. But Naranjo allegedly was the one who actually created the types, the personality types from the system. And that's where that came from. But and this is actually in an interview with that Claudio Naranjo was doing. I have a link saved for it somewhere if you want to share that at some point. But in this interview, he says that they made up the ancient origin story so that it would essentially get more famous. He said Oscar Wilde made this said this, that if you want an idea of yours to become famous, to attribute it to someone famous. And so he said, we basically then made up this ancient origin story so that it would help our ideas become famous. And so that's, you got that kind of ancient Eastern mystic origin roots. But the other one that then Naranjo goes on to say is that he actually developed the specific types. And he said he did that through observation and automatic writing, but mostly automatic writing. And so automatic writing is where you essentially put yourself into a trance-like state and you allow a spirit of some sort to like write through you and use your hand as a tool to write. So he directly says that that's how he developed it. And so if we're looking at that perspective, then you have another kind of way to say like, yeah, this is possibly demonic or new age in its creation. So that would be a legitimate concern, I think, for some. But I look at it, so there's kind of two issues I have with that and the whole rejecting it because it is because of its origins or because it's possibly demonic or new age or whatever. So one is that I think when Naranjo says he created it through automatic writing, I think he was probably just in some sort of hypnotic type state and writing his own thoughts through that. I don't think it was some sort of demon or spirit or something writing through him. I'm open to the idea that it was, but I think kind of simplest explanation and what we know from the science of those types of things, it was probably just him in a hypnotic type of state where he was writing and not fully like aware of or thinking of what he was writing. So that would be one. The other is the problem is that if it was, say, given through an evil spirit of some sort or it has new age origins, if it's true, right, that creates a real big problem for people to say you can't use it, especially because so much of it has become public knowledge. So because it's information, it's not like some book or tool or something that you can say like this is a book for another religion. It's like it's information that is potentially true. And so if it's true and you notice because of someone's type that maybe you should keep an eye on them for being suicidal, be like, oh no, wait, that came from the Enneagram. My knowledge that that person might be suicidal, you can't act on it, right? Because now you're using this demonic tool. So it puts you in this kind of weird position to actually say you can't act on it and use the information that came from a demonic tool. And I get the point of not wanting to use it. I would never advise anyone go to kind of seek that information from a psychic or kind of what they would consider a demonic source. But if that information does become widely known and that information is actually true, then that's kind of a weird spot for Christians to be in, to have to reject and specifically not use true information.
Hey, let me give you an illustration. Let's say I don't advise doing a seance, but let's say that you went to a seance and something appeared and it said you've got a tumor in your abdomen. And based upon the testimony of whatever happened at the seance, you happen to go to the doctor and the doctor says, you actually do have a tumor in your abdomen. You don't know what the source, if it was a demonic spirit or something else, but what you do know is you've got a tumor in your abdomen and you've now got to act on that information. So
Right.
that whatever the source of it, if it is yielding true information about the psychology of human beings and how we interact with one another, then you just act on it like you would act on a correct diagnosis of a tumor, irrespective of its origin. So
Right.
that the origin issue is really a secondary one. Is that fair to say?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And that's kind of my approach and where I've come at the Enneagram in the work I've done is to try and look at it from a purely scientific perspective. And I've looked at and considered and read up on kind of the origin thing. But yeah, for me, is this thing, does it accurately describe people? And that's been where my focus has been.
Okay. I'll just say one more thing then about that. All truth is God's truth. And I mean, Paul in Mars Hill, he's quoting from the Stoic philosophers, and he can find truth there. In him we live and move and have our being. So if the Enneagram came out of a non-Christian, ancient mystical source, but it did yield psychological insight, then all truth is God's truth, and God claims that as his truth. Which brings us then to, the big question, does the Enneagram work?
Yeah, so that is the big question. That's the number one people kind of reason people will use it is they say, well, it just works. It worked. It helped my marriage, or I saw it help my relationship with my kids, or all these different things. So it's hard because I don't want to be in the place to tell people like, well, it didn't actually work, or maybe it worked for you but you shouldn't use it. So it's kind of hard. I don't want to do that. But on the other hand, and I think more of these types of stories are starting to come out because the Enneagram has become more popular, and some of the hype around it has died down, but starting to hear more and more stories about how people have used it and it caused them severe harm. So I know a story of someone who it was the primary factor that led to their marriage ending after 22 years. So not just like they got married and started using it and then divorced, 22-year marriage. Another one, so I actually just listened to a podcast someone sent me yesterday. So on this podcast, it was a podcast on spiritual abuse, and they kept talking about the Enneagram and the role the Enneagram played in it. And they weren't clear on that, but that was one of the things that was going on. So I actually reached out to them to see if I could get more information. But I've heard other stories of it causing relationships to end, or people to question essentially their own sanity or well-being because their types didn't work for them, or it caused them strife, or even being used and being used as a tool to stereotype others. So I know of an organization that it was being used widely through the whole church, and then it was noticed that it was kind of being used as a tool to kind of stereotype people. And so then they stopped using it. So I think as we see more of those stories, I think that'll be that's terrible that that's happening, but good in the sense of like my hope is to get people to stop and slow down and say, okay, well maybe it did work for me, but is it still good to use and promote? Because it could be, maybe it was good for me, but it may not be good for another person, or maybe it was good for me this time, but it won't be next time, because ultimately, again, it is inaccurate, and there's lots of ways we can test and show that it's not accurate, and there's reasons why we can say, even though it's inaccurate, here's why it seems like it does work.
Okay, one more thing though, before we kind of dive into some of that information and analysis. Is there like an economic dimension here? Is it like you have to buy pay $59.95 to get the Enneagram test in order to know? Because if there is, then we also have the additional factor of, it's like buying the dowsing rod online to find water on your property. If it doesn't work, you've just thrown away your money. So is that also an issue, or is this just public domain?
Yes and no. So interestingly, um, I forget if it was Claudia Naranjo or Oscar Chazo, one of the two actually sued Helen Palmer over the Enneagram back in the 80s. I want to say maybe early 90s. So they sued her because they were saying that, well, we created this, it's our proprietary information, and so you can't go around using it, because she was spreading, I think her book had just come out or was in the process of it. And they actually lost, essentially because they said, well, if this is their claims that this is just true information about the world that they just noticed, then they can't copyright that, or prevent people from having that information. So in that sense, it is actually public domain, the Enneagram itself, but you do have a lot of people who have proprietary versions of it, or they're selling kind of information on it. So books, for example, is one, but you can go and get certified by some of these organizations by paying $100 or a few $100 to go to a seminar for a weekend. And some of like the podcasts or different resources are cost money or things like that. So there's definitely, it is public domain, but there's also people profiting off of it and selling information from it, or
Okay,
even to take the test.
right. Okay, so then let's segue to. I want to hear what evidence is there, scientific evidence, that it doesn't work particularly well, and then why do people end up thinking it does?
Yeah. So one thing I noticed when I started doing research on this was that pretty much everyone that did research. There's very little actual scientific research on it. Most of the research was actually just in thesis or dissertation projects that didn't end up getting published. So typically someone will write a thesis and dissertation and they'll publish it in a journal article after that, maybe even a couple articles, because it's usually a bigger project than a single article. But a lot of those didn't end up getting published. There's lots of reasons why that could be. But a lot of the quality of the science, even the ones in the published journals, just aren't very high quality. So for instance, one that actually is published by David Daniels, they claim that it was effective in their paper, even though in the discussion section of their paper, but in the results and what they hypothesized, it didn't work. So what happened is they had a control group who used it short term, and experimental group, and technically they're both experimental groups, who used it long term or more in depth. And so they hypothesized that the group that used it for longer and got more training on it would grow more on their measure of personal growth or whatever than the other group. Well, they didn't find that that was the case. And so then what they did is they split them up into individual groups. So they had like 6 different training centers where they ran it at. And so then they tested all of them individually to see if any of them changed. And they found one group had higher post-test scores than pre-test scores. And so they concluded that therefore it showed evidence that it worked. The problem is they didn't compare it to the control groups like they said they were going to. So it's just before and after. So it could be from 1,000 different things. And 2, they ignored the fact that some of the groups actually went down. So their pre to post scores went down. And so they weren't kind of evaluating and looking at these things. And just, so what we would do, we would call that either p-hacking or phishing in the field of science. So we go around just running a bunch of different tests to see if something is statistically significant, to see if it can support your claim. So we frown on it. So normally things like that don't get published, or if they're in a paper, when it goes to peer review, they're like, okay, the rest of this paper is fine, but this part's not, so take it out. But sometimes when it's in lower quality journals, those things can get through a little easier. So ultimately, most of the people doing research on it are Enneagram advocates, and I can tell, and the way you know and why it shouldn't ultimately matter, but it does because of some of those issues. Because the reason I know they're Enneagram advocates is because they are hypothesizing that it will work. So say the Enneagram predicts this, and therefore this is what we think will happen. There was a single article in the 90s that hypothesized they would not find results. And so he actually had people try to have very shorthand descriptions of the types. And he had people who didn't know about the Enneagram try to put those in order, how they think they should go next to each other based on similarities. And he got that they ended up, the similar types ended up together no closer than chance. So that was the only one that hypothesized that I know of that thought that there would not be, the Enneagram would not be supported. All the rest did. And essentially through these, I think there's 30 journal articles and 100 dissertations or something. Basically, most of them find mediocre results. Sometimes their hypotheses are supported, but sometimes they aren't. So they'll say maybe their hypothesis about type 1s are supported, and type 3s, but not all the other types. Or sometimes they're even in the opposite direction. So it's very kind of hit or miss and up in the air. So very much what you would expect if it was just kind of random, or maybe if there was a little something to it, but not like really just very accurately describing people.
Okay, why do people then have that impression? Because I've met many people who are very enthusiastic about it, believe it's been a very helpful heuristic for them to understand themselves and their relationships to others. Why do they have that impression if statistically it's not really much better than a sort of chance?
Yeah, and if you want, we can talk about some of those other tests, the way it's been tested as far as like retest reliability and accuracy and things like that. But so we can do that. But let me answer your question here. So I think there's 2 reasons. One is that for some people, it really probably did work. So just by chance alone, or maybe just very poor level of self-awareness or something, it really, the Enneagram itself probably did work for some people. For others, it would be kind of what we call an attribution error. So imagine you're sick and you take 10 different remedies to try and get better, right? You take vitamin C and you sleep and you try to eat some healthy food and you take some other get well medications and supplements, right? And cold medicine. And so you take all these different things. You can't know which one of them, if any of them made you better. But if you just say, oh, you know what? It's because I drank 3 glasses of orange juice. That's what got me better. Oh, you can't say that. And so a lot of people, what they're doing with the Enneagram is they're doing the Enneagram and they're reading and doing this about themselves, but then they're discussing it with other people and their spouse or their friends, or they're actually taking time to stop and think and reflect, regardless of what the Enneagram is actually saying, right? They're reflecting on who they are and how they interact with people and thinking about whether or not it's good or beneficial and how they can overcome it. So it's not that it's the Enneagram, it's that they're doing the work to self-reflect or engage in or be open to constructive criticism from other people and have those conversations. The Enneagram is a tool to get them there, which is great, but it's not the Enneagram itself that is helpful. And then the last reason why it seems like it would work would be because of just the normal psychological biases that we have. And I'm hesitant to use the word biases. I think heuristics often better, but we have a lot of mental shortcuts that our brain uses to get us through so we can make decisions quick and move and we can function. And this is one of them. And so there was actually a really cool study back in the 40s. So it's actually the effect is named after him, although sometimes it's more commonly it's known as the Barnum effect. But this paper was from Bertrand Forer. So it's sometimes called the Forer effect as well. And so what he did was he gave his students a personality test, and then the week later he gave them their results back. But what he didn't tell them is they all had their same results, and these results were composed that he got them from an astrology book, and so they were what we call Barnum statements. They're very broad, general statements that kind of describe everyone, or double-barreled statements. So things like you're typically shy and reserved, but sometimes you're really outgoing. So kind of statements that kind of go both ways. And basically all his students rated the results as very accurate, and some were just accurate. And only one out of, I think, was it 23 students or maybe 35 students rated it below average, like below a 3 on a 5-point scale. And so they're laughing about it after he kind of revealed the results, but we have this tendency to not be very aware of other people and what they are thinking and feeling and doing. And so when you have these broad statements that apply to everyone, but they're kind of more about our internal thoughts and processes, we're like, holy wow, this describes me extremely well. And I've actually taken those items from Forer, and when I've presented on this before, given this to people as a personality test and their results. And one of the answer choices I have on it, instead of like describes me well, kind of well, sort of well, kind of thing, I put on there eerily accurate. So this one line description is eerily accurate. And with these broad statements, I usually get per person 2 or 3 statements per person that are eerily accurate out of 10 statements. And so when they're wrapped in with this and they get this, like, oh wow, it like gives them goosebumps that these statements are so accurate about things that they think and feel, then they're willing to accept some of these other things in there that maybe it's like, well, I don't know if I'm really that way, but I must because it got right here. And in some cases, it's general good advice. So if I give you good advice and I say, hey, Randall, because of your type, you should be kinder to other people and it'll be really good for you. It's like, well, yeah, that will help you. But guess what? That will help everyone else. Yeah. And so sometimes there are many ways the Enneagram really is giving people good advice, but that good advice isn't based on their type. It's just good advice for all people. But again, the fear and the problem is sometimes that advice is adopted in ways that aren't always beneficial. So for instance, I think it was for type 4 on the Enneagram Institute website, it says, you should not be in your head so often because you have anxiety or whatever, and so you need to talk more with people. It's like, well, that might work for some, but people who have very high levels of anxiety or like an anxiety disorder or just very nervous or shy, that is mental practice for them when they rehearse things in their head. And so now you're telling them not to do it.
Mm.
And so that's not going to go well for them in many cases. And so it can be really harmful for them. And so those are the things we don't always hear. We just see it worked. It's like, well, it worked because of those other reasons I already described.
Okay. You mentioned the possibility you could say a little bit more about how one actually goes about doing these tests for accuracy and so on. So we've got a few more minutes. If you'd like to give us a little bit more of a taste of that.
Yeah, so we have a whole bunch of ways that we test any scale that we're going to use or test or construct system as psychologists. We have a lot of them, so the intelligence, personality, attachment, religiosity, you name it. Right? And we have tons of measures to test these. And we use largely the same method. So one of those methods is going to be test, retest reliability. So if I have something I'm measuring that I expect is going to be fairly stable over time. And so the Enneagram is actually never supposed to change in your whole life. So that's really stable. And so if I test you at one point and then test you again, you should score the same way. And
Mm.
so when this has been done, the scores on that have been, we call it test retest reliability, have been kind of below standard norms for what we would expect. So usually we're looking at a correlation between the pre and post test around a 0.7, and they're actually much lower than that. I forget the exact number for the Enneagram, but some were embarrassing low. So it's different for each type. So some of the types are above that mark, some are not. So that would be one way. Another is what we call internal reliability, and essentially this is a measure of consistency. So if I have 5 questions for type 1s, are those 5 questions highly correlated with each other? Because if not, they're probably testing something else, something other than what type 1s are. So type 1s should mostly be answering these questions the same way. There might be some variation. So you might answer, if these 5 questions are on a 5-point scale, you might answer 3 on one of them, 4 on 2, 5 on 1, and maybe 1 on one of them, right? Might be an outlier, but over a large population, you get these should clump together statistically. And so when we do that, again, we have kind of standard norms that we use, and the Enneagram's kind of all over the place where most types are right around the kind of 0.7 mark, which is what we kind of look at for acceptable, not good, but acceptable, but often below that, even much below that, and some are higher, and it depends on the different version of the test. So you just get really kind of poor, what we call them psychometrics from that. So we also have inter-rater reliability. So if you take one version of a Enneagram test versus another, so a written test versus typing yourself, or 2 different written tests, or maybe you type yourself and you're typed by an expert, so any method. So when we compare that, again, scores are below what we would expect for something used in the field, especially if it's used for clinical purpose. And the other is just predictive validity, so utility. So if I say, hey, I think the Enneagram is going to be helpful for helping people with their anxiety, and so I'm going to train people on the Enneagram and then measure their anxiety before and after and see what happens. I think they'll get better. And then we look and see that they don't get better on anxiety, then we'd say, well, it didn't work. And that's essentially what we see with some of the literature, is where they test that, they'll train people on it, and like the Daniels one I already talked about. Sometimes they get better, but sometimes they get worse, or they don't change at all. And again, some of these articles are done really poorly, like the statistics and things are done wrong. So they'll have a control group. So they'll have one group who uses the Enneagram, and then another group that doesn't, which is good. But then when they do their final results, they actually don't compare the 2 groups. They just compare both before and after. So it's kind of a thing, and that's the wrong way to do it. That's the whole point of having a control group, because there's so many other things that can change your level of anxiety or other things over the course of 8 weeks or 2 days or whatever else might be, whatever that time frame is. And so even giving the benefit of the doubt that what they're doing is accurate, the scores still typically fall below or kind of right around what we consider acceptable.
All right. So where does this leave people who, let's say within their church, their organization, they're using the Enneagram, they've found it to be useful, but if they now have what you've described as sort of the general results of psychological research doesn't bear that out, what other alternatives could there be? Are there other alternatives that they could use?
Yeah, there are. So within personality science, the main measure that's widely used is the big five. So I know a lot of people like the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs. It's the one that gives you 4 letters. That's actually really poor with psychometrics as well, and not really very accurate, and is almost never used in actual scientific research. The big five is the go-to, and you can Google big five test or um, and look that up. There's lots of tests you can take. Another one is called the Hexaco, Hexaco, which is essentially the same thing, but there's one extra dimension on it. A little better on predictive validity. So that would be another one you can actually go. I always forget if it's hexaco.com or hexaco.org, and you can go take a free version of the test there. So you can do some of those tests. And see another one that might be really useful that relates might be like an attachment scale. So again, if you Google attachment type test or something like that and see kind of what you get, and I can send you some links that you can post as well for some other ones, and you can see kind of some of your scores on these, and they'll show you kind of either a raw score or sometimes a percentile, so how you compare to other people. The problem with a lot of these tests is they don't have, and this is why one of the reasons I think the Enneagram has been so successful, is they say here's essentially where you are compared to others, and here's where you need to grow, and here's where you can improve and get better. And you don't really have a lot of that with some of those other personality things. You have to really do a lot of digging into the scientific research to see the pros and cons for each and where it is. And so but I think that can be done actually quite easily just through kind of reflection and conversation. And so conscientiousness is one of the factors on the big five, or the Hexaco. It's one of the ones that has the most predictive validity for, say, outcomes in life. It's basically how like dutiful are you and orderly and responsible, might be another way to say it. So let's say you score low on conscientiousness. You can read the description of conscientiousness as what I described. So people who are low on conscientiousness probably don't get a lot of their work done. They're not very organized, right? They're not very neat. They don't often come through with their responsibilities. They're often maybe late. So you can look at that and say and reflect and talk with a group or of people or a spouse or friend and say, okay, does this describe me? Okay, yes, okay, now here's some things that I can do to try and improve and make that better. And you can do that in conversation and safe place, and I think get better outcomes than you would with the Enneagram. And that's just the same with attachment, relates to how you relate and communicate with other people. So that could be really useful for that, especially in marriages or parenting. And that's I'm glad you asked the question, because I think that's one of the reasons, strongest reasons not to use the Enneagram, is because it prevents the use of better models.
Right.
Right. And so actually I'm working on a book right now on the Enneagram. And so I'm talking about the story of Galileo in there. And so, Galileo came and showed that, or at least really strong evidence, or refuted some of the arguments for a geocentric universe. But that geocentric universe, that model that they had to show that everything revolved around the Earth, that model was so ingrained in people of the time that it prevented them from seeing and accepting evidence that was contrary to it, or accepting and using a better model. I think we see that a lot with the Enneagram, as people get into using the Enneagram, and it becomes kind of a culture, and people really love it. And that prevents them from using some better tools or growing even further. Maybe it grows them a little bit, but it's preventing them from getting really further long-term results.
Good point. Yeah, I mean, if again, maybe it's not fair to compare it to a dowsing rod, but if there are better ways to find water in your property, then don't get the dowsing rod. Now, you mentioned you're writing a book on this. Where's that in process? When do you expect to be done?
Yeah, so that's with Lexham Press. Supposed to turn it in May 1st, so hoping actually to get done before that, but working on a dissertation at the same time makes it kind of tough. It was actually supposed to be coming out of my dissertation, but essentially my committee said that doing work to scientifically evaluate the Enneagram didn't make a large enough contribution to the scientific literature. So we already, because I presented on it, I did my qualifying exams on it. They said, we kind of already shown that we have enough literature already to show it's not very reliable. What's the point of doing more? It doesn't make a big enough contribution. So kind of pivot and go a different direction, which I think is ultimately better. But now I've got kind of two major projects I'm working on right now. So
Okay.
it's due in May. Don't know when it'll be out. I'm going to try and get it done sooner, but I've already done a lot of the work for it. I just need to kind of put it into a more popular level, easy to read kind of language. So who knows? I don't know when that'll actually be out. Maybe late 2023.
Yeah, well, usually it's about a year with a publisher. It depends,
Right.
maybe 9
Yeah.
months.
Right.
Awesome. You know what, then we'll have to have you back on to when the book comes out to talk about it. Jay, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating discussion, great topic. We will be including several links at the bottom of the show notes for those who are interested to read more. So, Jay, thank you very much again.
Yeah. Thank you.